Good morning and welcome to today's meeting of the Local Pension Committee, which is taking place at County Hall in Glenfield. This meeting will be broadcast live via the County Council website and will also be available for viewing after the meeting. I have received apologies from Mrs. Wright and I welcome Mr. Dan Harrison, who is present as a substitute for Mrs. Wright. I've also received apologies from Mr. Betchar and Mr. Lombardo. And Mr. Clark is joining us online. Before we commence the meeting, I would just like to say that given the size of the agenda, we are now limited in how we dispatch it to members. In future, as always has been the case, we will send out the private reports and manager papers via egress. If you have any issues in accessing egress, then please contact Angie, who will be able to assist. Also, at the in-person training sessions, officers will be available to assist members who are setting up and granting access to the modgov.app, where you will be able to view the private agenda pack in full when it's published. So I think all the reports are on modgov.com, but you can access them through egress as well. So now on to the main agenda. The first item is I propose the minutes of the meeting held on the 26th of January 2024 are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning to everybody. I had hoped not to have to raise this, so I'm marginally disappointed. The minutes are fine, apart from the very last bit, where there was a lot of discussion around my motion, and we got to a much happier place, I'm happy to say. But the last part of that, and the only bit I'm challenging, Chair, is we agreed unanimously that the change to the motion is fine, but after the meeting that I would meet with officers to discuss a way forward for how we categorise. I think that's a positive piece of work, but I've heard from nobody and it's not recorded in the minutes. So if you remember, when I remember verbatim what I said I was nervous about that, and I was right to be nervous, unfortunately, because what was agreed's not happened. I'm not saying it won't happen in the end, but it could have happened more expediently, and it's not recorded in the minutes. So only one challenge, Chairman. It's not recorded that I would meet with officers following the meeting to tease this out. Yeah. Everything else that flows from it is fine. Yeah. And I wonder why, and I've not received a telephone call. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Well, we'll address that if officers will contact you. Right. Happy, Declan.
But if members aren't getting contact, they are free to contact officers directly.
Yeah. So just take it up with officers directly. No. Was it informally agreed that they didn't? We wouldn't normally record that, to be honest. If officers have said they're going to do it, they usually do it, and they will do it. But do feel free to contact officers direct. If they don't come back to you in the next week, get in touch with them. All right. Okay. So with that noted, I propose that we accept the minutes of the meeting held on the 26th of January 24 are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is that agreed? Agreed. So that's agreed. Question time. Item number 2. I have received no questions. Question 3. Questions asked by members under Standing Orders 7.3 and 7.5. I've received no questions. To advise any other items which the Chair has decided to take as urgent elsewhere on the agenda. I've not been notified of any urgent items. So item 5, declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda. Does any member have any interest they wish to declare relating to items we're discussing this morning? No, there's nobody who does. So the first substantive item on today's agenda is the committee terms of reference. The first substantive item on today's agenda is the committee's terms of reference at pages 15 to 26 of the agenda. Fiona McMillan, Head of Law and Deputy Monitoring Officer, will present the report. So, Fiona, over to you, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, members. This report is brought to you this morning to seek approval for a revised version of the committee's terms of reference. Terms of reference were last reviewed in November 2020 following a high-level governance review of the pension fund and recommendations made by Claire Scott, the fund's independent advisor. This was in order to meet the expectations of the pensions regulator and the emerging themes from the Scheme Advisory Board's Good Governance Review. As part of that review, it was agreed that the terms of reference would be reviewed at least once every 3 years or earlier following any significant change in the law or guidance. This review has been undertaken by an officer working group, including the Director of Finance and the Director of Law and Governance, in accordance with that requirement, and has had regard to legislation, guidance, and, for comparison, other authorities' terms of reference. The revised terms of reference are set out in the appendix and retain the key features of the original terms of reference, such as the number of times the committee meets every year and the number of members on the committee. The revised terms aim to offer more detail and clarity about the role and function of the committee and its members, along with highlighting the legal requirement for proper advice to be provided before the committee takes decisions. I hope you've all had an opportunity to consider the appendix, but I'd like to draw your attention to the following key changes. There's a new paragraph 2 entitled Purpose of the Committee, which has been added to properly emphasise the committee's principal aim of considering pensions matters with a view to safeguarding the interests of all fund members. Paragraph 3 on the responsibilities of the committee has been updated to include reference to management of responsible investment and the net zero strategy. Paragraphs 3.4, 4.2 and 4.3 have been expanded to emphasise the committee's fiduciary duties, along with the requirement for members to prioritise the interests of fund members over and above their own personal and political beliefs, in accordance with advice previously given to the committee, both in training and during meetings. Paragraph 4.6 on training has been strengthened to specifically refer to the fund's training policy. As has always been the case, any substitutes that attend a meeting on a committee member's behalf must also have undertaken the induction training, and they must adhere to the fund's training policy and such other training as the administering authority considers appropriate. Paragraph 6.3 and 6.4 have been added to enable a reserve employee representative to be appointed in future at the fund's annual general meeting. Paragraph 8.3 has been updated to reflect the current process of the chairman and vice chairman being nominated at the County Council's annual meeting from one of its 5 voting members as the administering authority for the fund, and noting at 8.4 that the chairman also acts as a shareholder on LGPS Central and chairs the annual general meeting of the pension fund. Paragraph 9.2 has been updated to reiterate the County Council's constitution regarding meeting procedures, public access and quorum. In addition, it has been expanded at 9.6 to reflect the legal requirement for this committee to take proper advice before making decisions. Therefore, where a member moves a new recommendation or an amendment during a meeting, that the decision of the committee can be deferred if, in the opinion of the chairman and or the Section 151 officer and or the monitoring officer, this is necessary to allow for such professional advice to be provided. Finally, at paragraph 1.3, these revised terms of reference are now also stated to apply to the investment subcommittee or any other subcommittee of this committee. So the recommendation is for the committee to approve the revised terms of reference.
Thanks very much, Fiona. I'm sure all members know our duties and role, and they set it out clearly. So does anyone have any comments or questions? Nick?
Yeah, thank you. The changes seem sensible and reasonable, yeah. And I have no problem about them. It's reiterating things we already knew, but it's actually quite helpful to actually have them stated. The only thing which hasn't changed, which I still think should change, is that I still think that the employee reps should have voting powers, the same as everybody else. That's my personal view, even though actually the number of contentious votes that we've had in this committee are few and far between, if at all. But just as a matter of principle, I still think that the members who's relying on the pensions should have voting powers. That's
thanks for that, Nick. Noted. So,
Mr. Bill.
Mr. Bill.
rather curious as to the reason why this is now being brought forward. Can I assume it's because, or partly because, one or two of us have been challenging the question of investment in the fossil fuel issue? Is that the reason?
No.
Is that the reason behind?
No, it isn't. It's to clearly set out the terms of reference of the committee, and really, it isn't anything to do with that at all.
Right. Well, what is the basic reason for this being brought forward?
Because the committee needs a terms of reference document,
which we didn't have before.
Which we did. Did we have one before? Yeah, we did actually. She just said it's just amending the existing terms of reference. Right. Okay.
Well, we were supposed to be reviewing the terms of reference every 3 years. It's now just over 3 years since we last reviewed them, so it's part of a cyclical review cycle.
So it's just a standard review, to be honest. Yeah. So if we have no other questions, the committee has been asked to approve the revised terms of reference. I'm happy to move the recommendation. Can I have a seconder? Thank you. All those in favour? Okay, that's unanimous. Mr. Cartwright, are you in favour of it? Well, don't spend too long. I abstain. Okay. And anybody against? No, so all in favour apart from Mr. Cartwright, who's abstained. So the next item on the agenda, the Pension Fund Business Plan and Budget. Simone Hines, Assistant Director, is here to present the report. So Simone, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So this item presents the Pension Fund Business Plans for 24-25, both in relation to administration and investments, and it also presents the budget for the next financial year as well. If I turn to the administration business plan first, that's attached to Appendix A. The main priorities, as you'll see through this, will be continuing the implementation of McLeod, as I'm sure you'd expect. Also implementation or working towards implementation of the National Pensions Dashboard, which we expect to need to be in place in 2026. A review of the pension regulator's new code of practice, which is due to come in later this month. And officers are working with Hymans to identify the changes that will be relevant there, and we'll be bringing back a further report on that to the committee. And then the business plan also highlights priority around procuring a new AVC provider as well. You've then got the investment business plan, which is attached at Appendix B. That covers 5 main areas. So we've got training, priorities, policies, assets, fund valuation, and then reporting. And you can see the actions in more detail in that appendix. If I then just move on to the budget section, which is section 14 of the report onwards, that sets out the proposed budget for the pension fund for 24-25, alongside an update of the current year budget and future year projections as well. And just important to note at this point that the pension fund budget is independent of the council's general fund budget as well. The table at paragraph 15 shows the budget from 23-24 through to 26-27, and it shows it split across investment management costs, LGPS central costs, and then the fund's own staffing support costs and actuarial costs as well. And we have included some additional staffing costs primarily to deal with the extra workload from McLeod in the budget. The table in that section also shows what the total admin costs are as a proportion of assets under management, which is quite a key metric that the fund keeps under review. And you can see that remains broadly static over the sort of medium term. And as the admin costs are rising, our assets under management are also rising. So the overall proportion is staying fairly static. You can see more detailed information on each of the budget headings further down in the report. And we've also included some benchmarking information at paragraph 38. And that shows that the Leicestershire Pension Fund admin charge is around £26 per member. And the national average is around £30. So the fund does compare pretty favourably to that benchmarking information. Okay, the committee, that's all I wanted to add. The committee is asked to approve the report, approve the business plans and the budget. Obviously happy to take any questions as are other officers before you do that.
Thanks very much. It is a fairly comprehensive report. So, Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Chairman. It's not really a question, just a couple of comments, if I may. I'm particularly encouraged and understand the speed at which we've acted with regards to McLeod. Let's not misunderstand this is as a result of a High Court challenge, not anything that any authority anywhere in the country has done wrong, either in the handling of the pension board or the fund management. But nevertheless, when something is addressed in this way, how you react as a result of that also has an implication, and I would say over and above and beyond, Chairman. And secondly, the attempt, forwarded choice, the training put into place initially, and the scale and the timetable for that going forward is very welcomed. I know we had some IT issues when we did the first one. There's no criticism there whatsoever. I enjoyed joining that immensely, and I found it helpful. And we've forged a way forward to have more members, more change more quickly. So 2 comments really, Chair. I welcome the training initiative and the extreme effort that went to make the first one a success. There were some issues, but they'll be ironed out over time, and particularly McLeod, which affects a small portion of people, but nevertheless very important, as being exemplary in the way it's been dealt with. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thanks for your views on that. Thanks very much, Mr. Cartwright. So, are there any other questions or queries? No. So, the committee has been asked to approve the Pension Funds Administration and Investment Business Plans and Pension Fund Budget for 24-25, and also complete the Hyman's online training module 2 Pensions Governance subsection LGPS Oversight Body, the Pensions Regulator, and note the training plan for the year as set out in Appendix C. I'm happy to move the recommendations. Can I have a seconder? Thank you. So all those in favour? Anybody against? Any abstentions? No. So that's unanimous. So we move on to the next item of the report, which is the summary evaluation of the pension fund investments of pages 55 to 72 of the agenda. Bulesh, you're presenting this report, so over to you, please.
Thank you, Chair. So this is our standard quarter report, which looks at the valuation of the whole pension fund. It also provides an update on the listed equity transition, which was approved by the subcommittee in April 2023. At point 3, you've got our standard table of various asset classes and their performance over various timeframes, 3 months all the way out to 20 years. One asset class still stands at double digits at 20 years, but will come under pressure to stay above 10% going forward, given the comparatives from 2004 to 2008 onwards. Points 4 to 8 provide a bit of market context, and these are provided in more detail within the appendix. There's a Hyman's appendix attached to this paper. Draw your attention to the table at point 8. It's an interesting graph. It shows effectively the price paid for per unit of earnings. Currently stands around 24 times, so not particularly low, but there's a nice correlation that shows that the lower the multiple paid, the higher the prospective forward returns. It's the kind of things that our investment advisor takes into account when setting our investment strategy each year that we bring to the January committee. Point 11 shows the portfolio changes in the quarter just ended to the 31st of December. I'll go through those in turn. Aspect and Pictet have both been divested in line with the recommendation earlier in 2023. We've done that gradually over the year. We've added to the Ruffer mandate, which is also within the targeted return group, and that's taken it towards the 3% of total fund assets. And Fulcrum, the new manager, the first of the 2 4-plan subscriptions at 30 million each, to take us to 2% of total fund assets. Finally, over the page on 58, the bigger one of the lot there is the reorganisation of the legal and general passives portfolio. That was wholly completed in November 2023, about 0.9 billion pounds of moves, and it moved us from 7 regional passive investment funds and 7 UK single stock funds into just 3 passive funds. The final redemptions for Pictet and Aspect did occur after the 31st of December in January 2024. So that closes out the position on those 2 mandates in total. So that completes the approval from the investment subcommittee. And at the time of writing, the final investments to Fulcrum and Ruffer to bring us to the 3% and the 2% I mentioned earlier have been planned and will be completed this month. 2 changes do remain to be completed from the 2023 listed equity recommendations. There's a redemption from the LGPS Central's Emerging Active Equity Fund and an investment into the LGPS Central Global Active Equity Fund. The net effect of that is a small return of cash to the fund. Officers have been in contact with another partner fund, so that's another one of the 8 funds that have a shareholding with LGPS Central, to see if we can enact a stock switch. So they'll be selling, we'll be buying, and we save costs that way. We'll try and align that so that it's beneficial for both of us. Moving on to 17, we've got cash holdings and outstanding commitments. The level of cash held by the fund is higher than the SAA, so that's a strategic asset allocation target of 0.75% of total fund assets. This, alongside cash flow, is presented to the ISC each quarter, and at the quarter end, the fund held £421 million in cash and another £48 million with Aegon as collateral for our supporting our currency hedge. Taken together, that's 7.7% of total fund assets. The excess has resulted from SAA recommendations in 2022 and 2023, which prompted a switch from liquid assets, which is mainly listed equity and target return, into illiquid assets within the income asset group. Happy to take a question there if there's any, or I can carry on.
Has anybody got any questions so far? Mr. Harrison.
Okay, so no is the simple question. It's that cash is there as a result of moving away from listed assets, i.e. equity, into private assets. And in the meantime, we have to hold it as cash whilst the managers who manage the private assets, so think of things like private credit, infrastructure, we can't just hand them the money in one go. They have to ask for it when they've got something to buy. So in the meantime, we sit with the cash. Interestingly, at the minute, we earn about 5.35%, so it's not sitting there doing nothing. So if it was a couple of years ago, we'd be sitting at 0.5%. We'll be very happy about that. But at this point in time, it's not a bad place to be.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Bhulesh. The 0.75 limit and our actual position of 7.7 are worlds apart, aren't they? So I don't know enough to understand, I guess, what we're doing to manage that. It sounds like it's actually quite a good position to be in with the returns, but perhaps you could speak to that for me, please.
Yes, so we do have a very low limit, and there is no intention. We need to be fully invested at any time. That's the target. We have made commitments, and we're looking at that over at page 60.23. We have made a number of commitments to those private markets, so we do expect all of that to be called in due course. So we're looking at least 18 months for most of that to be called. It will end up in infrastructure, private credit, property, and liquid MAC. So that's multi-asset credit.
Carry on, Lisa.
Thank you, Chair. So 18 months until we're compliant with our own SAA, or do we need to edit the SAA, or what's that? What's the risk in that?
So the strategic asset allocation is taken to committee once a year. We've always had a position of being fully invested, so we don't reflect short-term changes like having lots of cash within that SAA. But it does take time for those managers to call all that money. I think there's a point in the document, I can't just find it at the top of my... There is a reference to how much we do have committed to these managers somewhere within here. So we go at point 21 and point 22. It's over 500 million easily that we have committed, and that will eat away at that cash holding over time.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Bhulesh, but we are dependent on the managers calling the funds, and most of it is allocated. It's just awaiting calling.
That's correct, yes. So we make commitments to things like private credit. The managers have up to 2 years to call all that money.
Yep, lovely. Thanks very much. So have we got any other questions or comments? No? So the committee is asked to note this report. Is that agreed? Yep, everybody happy with that? Great, thank you. Next, we moved on to agenda item 9, the report on the risk management and internal controls at pages 73 to 84 of the agenda. Ian Howe, pension manager, is presenting the report. So over to you then, Ian. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Good morning, all. So this is the quarterly risk register that we bring to all board and committee meetings. There's not a great deal of change from what you saw at the last meeting, other than a couple of minor changes. There's been no changes to the scores in a couple of the risks, but we have added a new risk following the comments at the last committee meeting, and that's one I particularly want to raise, and that's the new one in regards to the government's autumn statement regarding the consultation on the next steps of investment. Following the committee meeting, we have added that as a new risk regarding the concerns relating to centrally proposed changes that may require the fund to make changes to its investments, pooling and governance processes. So that one has been added following committee comments. So thank you, committee. The other two where we have made changes to the wording are in regards to the investments decisions being made without sufficient expertise. It's a recommendation really that the committee members undertake the training needs assessments in order to have the necessary knowledge and understanding to be able to make those decisions. So we've added that in. And risk 16 regarding the death benefits to pensioners can cause an overpayment if we're informed late or there's fraud. What we've discovered is there's some ongoing work from a system provider that we use that's actually developing this area more. There's going to be greater emphasis in this area from the system provider. So we've added that in there, and that's something we're going to be looking at as we see that's potentially going to be a benefit to the fund moving forward. The other changes are corporate. There was a corporate change to the risk management policy, which is now incorporating more to do with impact on the environmental risk. We've been through the risk register and we've checked that. There's no changes to the risks from it, but we wanted to raise that as it's a corporate change. And the final comment, which is slightly different to what we'd normally expect to see in this report, but there's been a change of chief exec at LGPS Central. Richard Lord Deeks is appointed as the new CEO, and he will start in the early summer subject to regulatory approval. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thanks very much, Ian. It certainly makes sense. Has anybody got any questions or queries on the risk management report? I think we've covered every conceivable risk I can think of. Nick?
Just welcome the new change of the new risk as per the committee.
Right, so if there are no other questions, yeah, sorry, Phil.
Reach that now. Yeah, so thanks for that. So just quick question. This LGPS Central company update, new CEO, obviously I appreciate that you chair that represents our pension fund at the meetings that are held. But will Mr. Lordeeks be coming out to meet the constituent member pension committees, or will he be? Because obviously
No, as I understand it, he is coming. He's coming in June. Is he definitely?
I think that's the plan. As Bill says, his appointment is subject to FCA kind of agreeing to it, but that would be the plan.
So he'll be coming round.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
He's got he came and to the last meeting of the shareholders meeting of LGPS Central and sort of introduced himself.
Sure.
And he's got a background in.
No, I've seen that. I just wondered if he was coming out.
No, he's going to come and see us, so which is good news.
That's
good news.
No, that's great.
All right.
Thank you. All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, Mr. Bill.
The autumn statement. How, in fact, does that put us at greater risk?
Well, I'm certainly hoping it doesn't. I mean,
it's obviously, as it's appeared on the risk register, there's obviously some concern. Could that be?
Well, I think when this report was produced, I mean, as I understand it, there is a requirement under the latest budget to have an investment in British equities, which I think we already have. So the level that is required are already there. Okay, so it shouldn't be any substantial risk there. Government interference in the pension fund obviously is going to be a risk, but there's most of those already covered. We only know what we know at the time the report is written, and in a changeable world, there's always new risks emerging, and we will keep up to date. What we can't do is second guess what's going to happen in the future, but this is a comprehensive report. But I do understand your concerns, David, I do. So, if there are no other comments and questions, the committee has been asked to approve the revised risk register. I'm happy to move the recommendation. Can I have a seconder? Thank you, thanks. And all those in favour? Anybody against? Any abstentions? No. So that's unanimous. We have now reached agenda item 10, which is the pension fund policy report, which is on pages 85 to 186. So, Ian, once again, you're presenting this report, so over to you.
Thank you again, Chair. We bring the report to committee annually, and it's a review of all the policies. There are a lot of policies relating to the pension fund, and what we've done is we've detailed them in the table in point 4. So all the policies are in the first column, and then whether it's existing policy, any change has been made. If there is a change made, that's identified in the report, when it was last updated, and the review for the next review of that individual policy. So I wasn't going to propose to go through this line by line, because obviously there's a huge amount in there. But just to bring out the changes, there's nothing of any major significance. I just wanted to make that point clear. A lot of it is actually what we already do, and we're just actually making it more explicit within the policies. But there are a couple that I just did want to sort of mention to you. One is regarding the employer risk. Scheme Advisory Board have recently published some information regarding potential changes that employers may start to request, which is things like partial terminations, or where they can sort of down risk and move into different investment vehicles, which would effectively have their own investment strategy. The fund isn't in favour of those because that adds a great deal additional administration. So we've added that into the employer risk policy. We propose to incorporate that in more detail into the funding strategy statement in November 25 as part of the review for the valuation. But we'd wanted it into the employer risk policy as a sort of a position as of now. The others really tend to be more regarding just making more explicit what we already do. But obviously, I'm very happy to take any questions from any of the members.
Thanks very much, Ian. Well, you can see how many policies we've got. It's fairly comprehensive. But have members got any questions or queries on any of the? Nick?
In terms of partial terminations, I totally agree that it's not. Don't believe it's in the interest of the members of the funds, and it's not in the interests of the employers either, who remain, because a one-off termination when times are good it is not a long-term strategy at all. So I welcome that method, and actually we should not be allowing that at all. It's not in the interest of the members, and it's not in the interest of the employers either.
No, I certainly wouldn't disagree with you, Nick. I agree entirely with that. Look, has anybody else got any questions? Phil?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Ian, for just outlining those key changes. But what I wanted to just ask about, really just picking up a little bit on what Nick's just said, this is about the partial termination is, I assume, has been driven by employers seeking to try and reduce the revenue hits on their day-to-day. But actually, if we put our hats on elsewhere, are most of the employer members of the pension funds, most of us, all of us in the main, are struggling with revenue issues and revenue pressures. And I'm just wondering if we are recognising anywhere in our risk policy the fact that potentially an employer could turn around and say, actually, we can't afford to pay any more than what we're paying. I mean, some employers I know are paying in excess of 30% contributions towards the fund. And I'm just wondering if the actuarial review came along and said, actually, employer X, you've got to pay even more than what you're already paying. And the employer turned around and said, well, we just can't, we haven't got the money to do that. So where does that leave things? And are we accounting for that risk? Have we got that as factored into the fund employer risk policy?
Okay, Ian, over to you.
No, it's a very fair question, thank you. I see that as a slightly different point, really. I think the partial terminations isn't really addressing that particularly. What that seems to be doing is kind of cutting it off at a point in time, discharging a bit of the liability and then kind of rolling it forward and keep doing that. And it keeps to sort of chunking it up, which isn't really addressing the actual real issue. I think the real issue, the point you rightly raise about the actual over long-term cost, is better scoped through the valuation. And I think at the next valuation, if we find that there is a position where rates are, say, going up again, or even as they are now, I think that will be definitely the point where we need to actually sit down properly and actually review the whole assumptions and then actually properly go through that with employers, because I think there might be challenge, but we've got to still look at the long-term funding, and it's that difficult balance is the honest position. But I don't see the partial terminations as actually dealing with that specific point. I think that's a different issue.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Have we got any other queries or questions? No? Yep, that's how some good points raised there. The committee has been asked to approve the revised risk policies appended to the report. I'm happy to move the recommendation. Can I have a seconder? Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Bill. All those in favour? Any abstentions? Any against? No. So that's unanimous. So we now come to agenda item 11, responsible investment update report at pages 187 to 224. Kat Chewy, responsible investment analyst, is presenting the report, and I hope I'm going to be able to welcome Miss. She's gone to get him. I got a moment of panic there. Just bear with me a second while Patrick and Sami come forward. reason he's not here is there's a major traffic incident on the M1, which yeah, could be. Oh, we've got them both. They're both here. Welcome, Patrick and Hamid. We thought we'd lost you for a moment. I'm very glad you're both here. So, we are we're now going to go to Kat. What's your Saturdays? Okay, Kat. So over to you, please, to present the report.
Okay, I won't talk too long because we've got Central here to talk about stewardship strategy, but we've still got the kind of normal quarterly responsible investment update. So we've got progress against the RI plan as Appendix A, and then also we have the fund's quarterly voting report in Appendix B, and then the report goes over some of the funds managers' stewardship reports. So we've got 757 voter recommendations at meetings. So that resulted in over 5,000 resolutions that were voted on. The fund voted with management by exception at only 3 of these meetings, and supported management on all resolutions at 371. So we opposed 1 or more resolution at 383 meetings. The majority of funds votes where the fund voted against was on board structure. So that kind of is a catch-all vote. So, for example, LGIM will vote against the chair of a board where they don't have a deforestation policy, and it can kind of really contain most places where fund managers are unhappy with the company. It was also just to highlight a number of our managers signed an announcement at COP28. So LGIM, Ruffer and Aegon, they signed a statement calling on, on the global adoption of the International Sustainability Standards Board's climate-related reporting at global level. And we know from our own climate reporting that the number of voluntary initiatives and differences reporting across the globe is really challenging when we try and collate this information. So if there's kind of a move towards a kind of global adoption of something like this would be really helpful for our own fund, kind of increasing our climate reporting away from equities and fixed income. But I'll leave it there unless anyone's got any questions on the kind of the main cover reports, and otherwise we'll go on to Central's stewardship strategy.
Thank you, Kat. Has anybody got any questions for Kat? No. I mean, we also had the climate risk management report I think Angie sent out the other day, which is really, really comprehensive and more or less highlights a huge amount of metrics and every single fund we've got, I think, apart from private debt, which is really good. Anyhow, I digress. I've hand over to somebody who knows exactly what they're talking about. So over to you, Patrick and Hamid.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for the invitation to come and speak to you. As requested, I think at the last time I was here, we agreed to come back and speak to you about stewardship and our stewardship approach, and what it means to us at LGPS Central and how we go about delivering our stewardship activities. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just to run through the order of the presentation. So we'll give you an introduction to stewardship. We'll talk about some engagement examples that we've been working on. Then we'll also talk to you about our stewardship themes for 2024 to 2027. Our stewardship cycle runs on a 3-year basis because we think that's really the minimum amount of time it takes to bring about some impact or influence through that stewardship programme, and that refresh has just happened this year. I'm sure you're aware of that. And then we'll give you some more detail on each theme, so what each theme is all about, and the areas that we are pushing on and why we've chosen those themes. We'll talk a little bit about our stewardship partners and how we work with them, and the key partnerships that we have. And at the back of the the presentation is a glossary of terms, so hopefully we won't throw any jargon around, and if we do, please stop us and we'll go through that. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So this definition of stewardship comes from the FRC, and it's not the only definition of stewardship out there, but we are members of the Stewardship Code, which is operated and run by the FRC, the Financial Reporting Council, which is sort of a regulatory body for financial reporting in the UK. So it says that stewardship is the responsible allocation, management and oversight of capital to create long-term value for clients and beneficiaries, leading to sustainable benefits for the economy, the environment and society. So this was a bit of a step change in the world of stewardship, which we'd always kind of considered to be the way in which we interact with the companies in our investment portfolio, and the way we engage with them, the way we vote at the AGM, how we act as stewards of these assets. But this definition is much more holistic. It's taking into consideration a broader responsibility in terms of how we manage the money of clients, how we manage client assets and secure those assets, and also how we consider broader implications to society and to the environment in terms of how those portfolios are constructed and how we engage with the companies within the portfolio. So this isn't just about shareholder primacy anymore and shareholder rights. It's about other stakeholders that businesses have. And I think there's a general recognition that a company that ignores its other stakeholders, its clients, society, its employees, is going to have problems in the future, build up problems for itself in the future. And companies that manage those stakeholder relationships better will perform better in the long term. That's something we definitely consider to be the case. And so there are three aspects really to stewardship. One is engagement, so those conversations that we have with companies, how we vote at their AGMs, and there should be a link there. You know, the engagement that we have with them should be reflected in how we vote at the AGM. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then escalation, so when these conversations don't go in the direction that we think they should be going, what do we do about it? And to reflect upon the fact as well, you know, in our active portfolios, the money is managed by external managers, and we appoint them and we do due diligence on them before we appoint them, and we monitor them. We have quarterly meetings with them to understand what they're doing. The investment teams have monthly meetings with them, but we have an RI meeting with them quarterly. And their stewardship activities is a big part of that conversation. What we expect them to be doing, how aligned they are with us on how they're voting and how they're engaging. And just to point out, we retain the voting rights for our mandates, so we do the vote. We think that's an important part of our role as an asset owner, as a steward, not to delegate that to somebody else. But even so, we're still interested in how they vote on their other shares that they hold, our managers, that is. And then we have an escalation process in place. So level one there of an engagement program with a corporate, with an investee company that we hold in the portfolio would be, you know, bilateral dialogue. So a conversation with, could be investor relations, it could be the sustainability people within the company, it could be the C-suite, so it could be the chairman or the CEO, CFO, other individuals on the executive board. And that could be a collaboration. So that could be with other investors, and it's often a good idea to get together with other investors because you hold a bigger portion of the company, and if we have more traction and you have more weight, well, it could be something that we would do ourselves directly. And then level two would be voting against management at the AGM. So there are lots of opportunities to vote against management. We get to vote on the approval of the report and accounts. And if the report and accounts are lacking disclosure around anything to do with sustainability, then we could vote against the report and accounts. We could vote against the chairman. We could vote against the CEO. There are often members of the board who are allocated responsibility for sustainability issues, and we could vote against them or their reappointment. And there are various reports around remuneration and climate that we could also vote against. So there's plenty of opportunity there to express our views. What's really important is that we don't just vote after the event. We write to the company and we tell them why we voted, because there's no point in voting and them not knowing why you voted against them. So we sent out 30, 40 letters last year after the vote to explain our position, and that often is a good way of initiating a dialogue with the company, because the best managed companies will want to know why shareholders are unhappy. And then we can make public statements, and we've done that in the past, and there is often a appetite amongst the ESG media to report on these things, but we're increasingly seeing this reported in the mainstream media as well during AGM season, which is, I think, an important way of putting additional pressure on companies, and we're not afraid to kind of utilise that additional lever when appropriate. And we can and do, and we will do this more in the future, go to the AGM physically and ask a question to the board. That's often a powerful tool, is to put management on the spot like that. There's lots of shareholder resolutions every voting season. Our default position is generally to support resolutions that are related to transparency. For example, we value transparency. We don't think you can integrate ESG considerations into investment processes without information and data. So we're keen on that. But we do look at every resolution on its merits, and some we support and some we don't. But we're very open to shareholder resolutions, and we will table shareholder resolutions on the ballot of an AGM ourselves. And we have done that, and we did it last year at Barclays, although that didn't go onto the ballot in the end because the company agreed with what was in the resolution. I think Sameer's going to talk a little bit more about that later. And then there is engagements need to be supported by, for want of a better phrase, the sword of Damocles, and there are two options there: litigation, and there was litigation against Shell last year. And whilst we weren't a litigant, we did support the action by providing evidence. It was brought by a group called Client Earth, and that is an option. It's not an easy option, but it is out there, and companies, I think, are increasingly aware of litigation risk when it comes to climate change. And then there is the threat of divestment. So by this, we don't mean the threat of divesting from a whole sector or a whole industry, but if a company isn't responding to engagement, and we think this portends material financial risks around the performance of the company or the reputation of the company, we can choose to sell those shares or sell down our position. And that's a conversation in active portfolios with the fund managers who manage the money on our assets. And they're normally generally quite receptive to those conversations. But equally, it's not it's something that we have to use not sparingly, but we don't want to become responsible for the management of the performance of those portfolios. That's ultimately the manager's responsibility. So the more restrictions we place on them, the more we influence the performance of the portfolios, and the less responsibility they have for them. And that's a dynamic that we have to manage carefully. And in passive portfolios, we have some room to remove companies from passive portfolios, but again, we don't want to detract too much from the underlying benchmark, because you're introducing tracking error and risk every time you digress from the underlying benchmark, that it's supposed to be mimicking in terms of performance. So happy to take any questions on that. I know that was quite.
Thank you, Patrick. Melissa.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Patrick. I'm really interested in these levels of engagement, and so you've mentioned a lot about conversations, and so I'm wondering, are they formal conversations? Are they recorded? Does someone take minutes? If you're a member of the Leicestershire scheme, can you see anything about those conversations, please?
We write them up in our stewardship reports and circulate them. In terms of, it varies a little bit. Sometimes they can be Chatham House rules, and companies are nervous about speaking in public forum about these issues. So the minutes and the notes from the meetings are often not made public, and there have been a few issues around that in the past where companies have spoken to investors, presenting a potential change to their climate strategy, for example, and all of a sudden that appears in the press before the companies had a chance to kind of consider how they would want to land that. So it's a bit of both, but we're very keen to be as transparent as possible. Our stewardship code report contains examples of that, and as do our stewardship updates. So there is detail in there, but the minutes generally from those meetings aren't made public. The minutes from the AGMs are very much so.
Thanks very much, Melissa.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Patrick, for the answer there. And I'm trying to understand kind of how we escalate through these levels a bit. So, so my two questions about that, I guess, are: have we ever divested? Have we ever litigated and done that extreme stuff? Because there's no point having kind of an empty threat, kind of, if we've never done it, they don't know if we ever would, I guess. And then my second question is, you've talked a lot about kind of voting at AGMs and other meetings, and I guess have we ever won any of those votes? And I guess what percentage of those might we be winning, to understand how much weight that those votes carry, please? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So in answer to the AGM question, a high level of dissent is normally around the 25 to 30% mark, and that's generally where companies take an interest. Because that's newsworthy, it gets in the papers, and if companies are incurring the wrath of about 30% of their share ownership, that's material. Now, there was a vote last year on the pay of the CEO of Morgan Stanley that got, I think, about around 60 to 70%, which is particularly high, and for a remuneration vote. Now, that doesn't mean immediately that he doesn't get the pay award that he was awarded, but next time the company devises its remuneration plan and package and how they calculate that, that's something that they have to take into consideration, the shareholders' kind of concerns around that. So, and it's, some of these votes are not binding in the sense that the company has to respond by enacting exactly what the shareholders have said. Ultimately, the management of the company is responsible for strategy, and that accountability needs to remain. And we're not trying to run the companies. That is the role of the CEO, to be observed and challenged by the chairman. So we don't want to interfere with the governance. But yes, there are examples of where shareholder votes have resulted in material outcomes. And then on the litigation, I mentioned the Shell litigation. Now, climate litigation, for example, is very difficult because you have to get a court to accept that this is an appropriate method for influencing the company's behaviour. And in the absence of some kind of financial loss that you can point to, it's hard to bring a case or an action through the courts. There was success in the Netherlands that did influence the strategy of Shell. And then there was this litigation that Client Earth put forward, but it got kicked out in the preliminary stages, and they lost the appeal. There is other litigation against companies that has been successful, like BP and a Brazilian company now who was involved in a corporate scandal where shareholders brought a class action, and that was successful. But that was that they were able to point to a financial loss associated with that, a deterioration in the share price. So that's normally one of the criteria for that sort of case. But it's continuing to emerge and being kind of explored and developed as a engagement strategy. And yes, there are companies that we've divested from mainly through conversations through these quarterly meetings with our external managers, where we've pressed them on their engagement and how their engagement is going, and they've recognised that engagement isn't going to work, and they've divested. So one recent example of that was Daikin, which is a company that was in our sustainability portfolio because they produce very energy efficient air conditioning units, so they have a good sustainability story. But they also had an arm of the business that was producing weapons, and when the Japanese government decided that they want to kind of change their defence policy, they almost forced Japanese industrial companies to participate in that rearmament program. So I'm sure Daikin really wanted to do it. They didn't get much revenue from it, but we felt it was inappropriate for it to be in a sustainability mandate. You wouldn't expect to see it there. So the two managers that held it in that fund sold it And then there was another Chinese company, an apparel company that had operations in the region where modern slavery is reported with the Uyghur people. And our external manager were engaging with the company, but it wasn't going anywhere, and they decided to sell that as well.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Ms. Cartwright.
Thank you, Chairman. Fantastic report and overall stewardship. Really happy about that. And that leads on really on to everything else. The identification of an issue, whatever that may be, it is encompassed in all of that, and happy with that too. It's a question you probably can't answer now, but it'd be helpful in the future. And that is, identifying an issue is part of the problem. The solution is getting from where you want to be to where you want to be in the end, accepting the fact that things don't work out perfectly every time. The question I have relates around the structure in the time frame from identifying an issue to getting to an overall resolution, because that has to focus one's mind because all of that time there's an element of risk there that isn't there before the issue is identified. Bit convoluted, I understand, but it's the time scale between raising an issue, because we can't do anything retrospectively, raising an issue, perfectly valid, and getting to a resolution to that issue. It doesn't matter whether that's positive or negative for me. It's just the time frame between the two dates to when it escalates. So using a penalty charge notice, for example, you get the penalty charge notice, you pay within so many days, you get a reduction. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about if it's resolved within 30 days, then it could be a green or an amber within 60 days or 90 days. I'm just using easy figures, but just trying to understand the rationale, probably for another meeting, between identifying an issue and a positive or negative outcome. You have mentioned something there that actually you can't control, and that is if subject to court proceedings, then you're outside, you're into the cul-de-sac of despair of court timings and all of that. But I'm talking about just day to day raising an issue, no matter how significant, then scoring it between red, amber, green, and getting a resolution, accepting the fact that it doesn't always work perfectly, but having a set time scale so that these things, there's no criticism here, so these things don't lapse, or that they're ramped up to more serious as a result of a lack of response to you raising your initial concern, if you see where I'm going.
Yeah, sure. And that does vary very much on the nature of the issue. So, there are things that, might appear in the press or we might pick up on through our use of MSCI's ESG data that we would speak to a manager immediately on, and if it's sufficiently egregious and pretends significant risk, we would expect the manager to respond immediately. Now, that's often things on the social side, so social risks, they crystallise pretty quickly. If you were to find modern slavery in the supply chain of one of the companies in the portfolio, that should be a quick resolution for them to deal with that, and that's something that we would pick up immediately because it's an immediate crystallized risk. With climate change, for example, that's a longer story that's looking to bring about a structural transition in the business model of these companies, and that would play out over a longer period of time. Those initial conversations would be about setting targets, plans, strategies, and disclosing around the management of those risks, and that would play out over a different period of time. So there is a variation there. And it's not always evident, but the immediacy of those risks is often clear. The other thing I would say, just because I don't think I answered that point fully, is in terms of identifying these issues. So we've just introduced, we're in the process of introducing a reporting that is very similar to the Climate Risk Monitoring Service, but it focuses on other ESG risks, so the other E&S risks. So immediate pollution issues, health and safety issues that companies might have a dam disaster, a tailings dam disaster at a mining company. On the social side, picks up modern slavery risks and risk of child labour. So we run our portfolios, the companies in the portfolio, through that methodology, through that report, to identify those issues, and that feeds into our engagement prioritisation. So at the beginning of the voting season, for example, we've done it just now, we will identify those priority companies that we're going to vote at actively at the AGM and that we're going to engage with during the course of the year. But that is dynamic. It will change during the year as issues arise that we become aware of that we couldn't have possibly predicted at the beginning of the year.
Just let me help you a little bit. Is there a matrix that sets out clear goals between identifying an issue and resolving it? Is there a matrix within your stewardship that's clear and transparent so that it focuses one's mind? That's really all I'm trying to get at. And if there's not, could there be?
Well, again, this is something that we worked on last year. We've enhanced our engagement tracker. So every engagement, meaningful engagement that we embark upon goes into this engagement tracker. And it has to have an objective to it. You know, if we're going to have a meaningful engagement and invest time with a company, what is the change we want to bring about? Over what timeframes could that happen? And what are the kind of milestones on the journey to that outcome? And we rate the engagement based on where we are with that. Now that not all of those will result in a conversation around divestment and not in the short term, but they are a way of kind of us gauging our success and communicating better the outcomes and the outcomes focused approach to our engagements, which I can understand can be a little bit abstract sometimes in the way we've reported it in the past.
Thanks very much. Melissa.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Patrick, for the transparency with which we're able to have this conversation. I'm finding it very helpful. So I guess perhaps naively, I was under the impression that we were kind of engaging with everybody with whom we invested because we've talked in the past, haven't we, about these the clear ESG goals that we were kind of working to. And I guess that I kind of assumed that then that was a central tenet to the conversations and just we didn't just put our money with somebody and then leave it there. We were kind of always talking to all of the companies where we held investments. Is that not the case? And if so, I guess we have to prioritise as we've been mentioning on the basis of risk and how dynamic that can be. But what percentage of those companies are we kind of even talking to, please?
Yeah, so we have over 3,000 holdings. And we can't possibly engage with all of those companies. We do vote at all of their AGMs. That's something we can do. But at the beginning of the year, we have a prioritization process, which is risk-based and looks, one of the criteria is how much of a holding we have in the company and how big it is in terms of our portfolio. So we have about 50 priority engagements at the beginning of the year. And our net zero strategy was a part of that prioritization as well as, kind of other broader ESG concerns that we have regarding the companies in the portfolio. So we will engage on those 50 companies. So out of the 3,000, there's 50 that are active. Now, we know that other organisations like Climate Action 100, LAP, EOS are also engaging on our behalf. So through our partnerships with those companies, and we have a relationship with and a contract with EOS as our engagement partner, our coverage would go into the I would say the first 1,000 of those holdings through those partnerships and our reliance on other agents. The other thing we do is we expect our managers across fixed income and active equities to have stewardship programs themselves. So we have these quarterly meetings with them where we ask them to give stewardship updates, and they're part of our coverage as well. They're appointed to manage our assets, and it's not just about investment performance, it's about the stewarding of those assets as well. So again, that increases our coverage.
Patrick, could I ask a question? Presumably before we invest in companies, we go through the ESG things every time we invest. Before we actually invest, we look at the company to assure ourselves that they're not involved in child labour or whatever. And because it is a fairly broad spectrum of things, it's not just climate change. ESG is not just climate change. There's a massive range of issues which you pick up on. And I think as time goes on, metrics will become more and more clear. I mean, the climate risk management report is an example of the detail that you go into and is really comprehensive. And my other question is, if you do divest, I mean, you're putting pressure on, are you just divesting to somebody who really doesn't care? And then they just get on with it and they say, well, all right, well, you divest because we're going to we'll get an investor who's not bothered.
Yeah, that's right. If we divest from a company, it's the shares are sold on the open market and another investor picks them up. So the influence that we would have on that company through our divestment is limited. The conversation that we would have in the run up to that and saying that, you know, this we find this holding no longer acceptable is perhaps more impactful. And the other thing about the reason why we divest from those holdings is because the risk that something goes wrong has become unacceptable. It's not just about to influence the company, it is about the investment risk associated with those issues that we've engaged with them on and they're not acting on. So it is driven by financial materiality and financial concern. And then the other point to your question is, when we appoint external managers, whether it be active equity managers or fixed income managers, we do a deep dive on their ESG integration credentials, what data they use, what people they have, their process and how they go about it. So our expectation is that before any of our managers were to invest in a stock, they would have done thorough due diligence on that stock, looking at the investment case for it, and it will have integrated ESG concerns into that. So the way we hold their feet to the fire on that is through the quarterly meetings where we go through the portfolio, pick out a company and ask the manager and their ESG people that they invariably bring to the meeting about how they got comfortable with these ESG risks and what they're doing about them in terms of stewardship and voting. So we can't do the work on every individual stock. We're not managing the money in-house. We can't look at every individual stock and tick it or sign it off. But there is a process for us to make sure that our managers are doing that when they invest. And that's something that is very important at LGPS Central.
So effectively, LGPS Central is managing the managers,
yes, so
that it goes down into a funnel and those managers are held to account for every single portfolio. No, that's as I understood it. Thanks very much. Have we got any other questions? Mr. Denny.
Yes, thank you, Chair. At the point where you're considering divesting, rare as it may be, and you tell them why you're doing so, do you go public on that?
No, we haven't. We haven't used that as that is a potential tool that we should use. Is that, you know, and you do see other investors doing this. You know, the reason why we're selling a stock is because we can't get comfortable with XYZ. That is a useful engagement tool, and that's perhaps something that we should do more in the future. The example I gave there of the Chinese company with the potential risk of modern slavery in the supply chain, us going to the press is probably unlikely to influence that company very, very much. But for example, when BP last year changed their climate targets, I engaged with a number of investors on that, and we did interviews with the Financial Times. So we talked about how we felt the process around changing this strategy wasn't correct. Now, that wasn't a divestment conversation, but it was an escalation into the press as to why we were really uncomfortable with what management had done. So that is a tool in the toolbox to explain why you're divesting as well.
Thank you. I'm very reassured really by all of this. I think they're doing as much as we can reasonably ask. I just think that is one part of your armoury you could use to have a real impact, you know.
Yeah, I think it's a case by case sort of conversation, what value that it would have.
It is, and as you say, the issues that arise are there's a multitude of them. It's not easy to specify them all the time into something that, you know, there is no one solution or no one timescale or anything else. But really, the information that you provided, and I think it will get clearer and clearer. And as I refer to this sort of climate change report that we've all seen, and when you go into that and see the metrics and detail, it's I think we are doing as much as we can, and it'll get better. Mr. King.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Patrick, for your very detailed answers to the questions that have been asked. And just picking up what Mr. Denny said, yeah, I think, you know, what you've done is reassure us that, you know, we've got robust procedures in place before we get into a fund to make sure they're meeting the criteria. because if you do that at the beginning, it does stop problems later. But just something that's just kind of made me kind of slightly concerned by what you said was just about the response to the answer about publicity and reasons for divesting. And I always, we're treading into the realms of politics. Well, we are potentially, depending on what the reason is and what we're divesting for. And that is then concerning me a little bit if the fund or Central was to then make a statement saying we've divested from Fund X because of whatever reason it is, because that may or may not then be compatible with the views of the pension fund, the constituent members of the Central group, fund. And I'm just a bit concerned. So I'm just assuming that if that was the case, there would be a process for getting that agreed by the 8 constituent partners of Central, because making what I call quasi-political statements about why, I mean, if it's bad management, it's bad management. But if it's because, how can I put it, people don't think they've done enough on some other issue like climatic things or some other issue, which is then getting into the realms of, politics, if I can put it like in the broader sense. I would want some reassurance. It wasn't just kind of, the kind of Patrick's view or your colleague. It was actually an agreement between the 8 partners of Central. I'm just wondering if you can reassure me about that. But just to also mention, you did actually say that at the end of the day, if we do divest from a fund, there's always a market for someone to then go and buy, because it's an open market. The stock market is what it is, buyers and sellers, and the prices vary depending on how many people want to buy a particular stock in a particular nanosecond of the 24 hours, as I'm sure you and I'm sure everyone here realizes. So, I'm not sure there's a lot of value in divest. Sometimes I suppose we've got to. You've got no choice if it's being very badly managed and the share price is diving down. But I'd be very concerned if we were divesting for a lot of the time, because that would be then very destabilizing, and it would, to me, wouldn't really bring us any benefit, because it's just turmoil. So, but on the PR thing, if you could just clarify that point, it'd be really great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So it's more a case of divesting from an individual stock than a fund. So, like the companies that I gave as an example before, like Antar was a Chinese apparels company. Now, we are conscious of not delving into politics, and fiduciary responsibility is always at the forefront of our minds. So when we have taken that decision around divestment, it's always been with the financial risk and the investment risk associated with holding that company. That is also a justification for us doing that. And I agree with you. By divesting, we're sending a message to the company, but how influential is that in terms of affecting the share price? Probably not very much, because we don't hold that much of it. So it's always underpinned by robust portfolio management considerations as to, do we want to hold this company anymore in the portfolio? And that conversation will be had with the fund manager, with our investment directors internally. On publicity, we have a communications team at LGB Central and a client relationship team. Those sorts of decisions would be signed off by the chief investment officer and I would imagine the CEO as well. And when we have generally gone to the partner funds with kind of announcements and things like that ahead of time. Now, but they're more, I wouldn't necessarily agree that we're delving into politics with those decisions. They're more on operational based issues. For example, with the BP situation that we couldn't get comfortable with, it wasn't so much around the moving of the targets, it was how they did it and the fact that they consulted with their investor base on their original transition plan, but they didn't consult with them again when they made changes to their transition plan. We consider this to be a core part of the corporate strategy. So that was a failing in my view, and I think the view of other investors in corporate governance, which I think is probably a non-political sort of conversation. So yeah, but we are conscious of the political backdrop to some of this stuff.
Yeah. Thanks, Patrick. Nick, you have a question.
Thank you, Patrick. It's very interesting, this. You just mentioned in your sort of introduction, you were talking about very rarely, and understand, removing stocks from passive indexes. I'm interested in examples of that within that. I understand that you don't want to do that often because it devalues having that index as a benchmark.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in how you actually do that.
Yeah, so we manage those passive indexes in-house. So we have a team that manages that, and their job is to track the underlying benchmark and the underlying benchmark performance. But in doing so, and the calculations and the maths behind this, they don't have to hold every single stock in the underlying benchmark to replicate the performance of the benchmark. They have a certain risk budget that they call it. So they can choose to hold certain stocks or not hold certain stocks. Again, it's a sparing thing because there's only a few occasions that you can do that. You know, they have to make sure that overall they're tracking the benchmark and managing the risk of underperforming the benchmark appropriately. So there is some tracking error budget, as it's called, for them to digress in a minimal sense from the underlying benchmark. It depends on the size of the holding. You know, if you were to try and do this with Apple, which is a big part of the benchmark, probably wouldn't be able to do that because it would be, you know, a lot of tracking error by not holding Apple in the MSCI World Benchmark, for example. That would not be an option. But there are around the periphery some options to do that, and there's an example of a company that had a controversy around controversial weapons that was a relatively small part of the benchmark that was not included, and it's rebalanced quarterly every time the benchmark rebalances. So there's that ongoing rebalancing thing going on.
Very much, Patrick. Now, we've had a fairly comprehensive.
We've got more slides.
Yeah,
there are. No, I know, but I'm just asking, is there any more questions on that part of the? No. All right, so please carry on.
Thanks, over to you, Sammy.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm just going to introduce a couple of key concepts. I think we've touched on quite a few of them in the course of this discussion, but firstly on active ownership. So we're very much active owners in the companies that we invest in, and we exercise our rights to kind of influence those companies' corporate practices and behaviour. Escalation, which we've touched on, where we are, you know, unsuccessfully engaging with the company, where we're not seeing the progress we want to see in an engagement, we can take steps to escalate our concerns. Patrick's shown you the kind of escalation strategy. We could vote against board management recommendation at the company AGMs. We could make public statements. We could co-file and support shareholder resolutions. And then finally, outcomes. I think there was a question about outcomes and the tangible results. This is a really key part of the stewardship strategy. We have been developing a engagement tracker, and in that we list all the individual engagements and how each engagement will have an associated KPI, so a key performance indicator. So we can really track on a case-by-case basis how much progress we're making, and that feeds into the escalation strategy. So if we're not making as much progress as we want to, we can take steps to escalate our concerns. If we go to the next slide, please. So why we steward our assets. There are a number of reasons why we steward our assets, but I just wanted to point your attention to the very first one here about protecting and enhancing shareholder value. It all comes back to kind of fiduciary duty. That's the primary reason we steward the assets. There are a number of other reasons: influencing corporate behaviour, contributing to best practice, aligning with partner funds' kind of values and purposes, and also enhancing trust with stakeholders. But I think fiduciary duties is really a primary reason for stewarding our assets. And then moving on to the engagement examples, I think Patrick's already touched on the BP example, but if we look at Shell, so back in 2022, we voiced our concerns with Shell's chair regarding the misalignment of the energy transition strategy with the goals of the Paris Agreement and the lack of kind of Paris-aligned goals. Encouragingly, Shell actually acknowledged that it has a role to play in addressing climate risk, which was positive, but noted the difficulty in setting short and medium-term Scope 3 targets for its upstream emissions. So then moving into 2023, we directly engaged with the company and we learned Shell's actually considering setting an absolute upstream target as part of its 2025 energy transition update, which is positive. And they also outlined that there are plans to invest $10 to $15 billion in low carbon solutions. They're yet to publish a CapEx strategy into 2030. So that's an additional piece of disclosure we'd want to see from the company. They are also releasing their climate strategy ahead of the 2024 AGM, and we've requested to provide feedback into the draft strategy so we can have our input into how they're managing their climate risks going forward. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oh, please. Right, so we also engaged with Barclays. We filed a shareholder resolution, which was all about asking them to report on their stranded assets regarding their financing of fossil fuel companies. And actually, before that went to the ballot, it got withdrawn because the company was engaging with shareholders to meet the ask. So that's a really positive outcome there. We've had a long history of engaging with Barclays, so this is kind of an extension of that. So again, positive news there. Could we go to the next slide, please? So these are our 4 stewardship themes. So previously, the 4 stewardship themes were climate change, plastic pollution, human rights, and responsible tax. Now we've got 2 new themes here. So natural capital is a new theme, and sensitive and topical activities. I just kind of want to stress the point that this isn't a complete overhaul of the previous stewardship themes. It's very much of a shift in a focus. So I'll talk through the climate and the natural capital, and I'll leave Patrick to talk through the human rights and sensitive topical areas activity. Sorry. So just on climate, some of you may know that we released our net zero strategy late last year, and engagements are very much a core part of that strategy. So climate change will remain a key priority engagement area for us going forwards. And just talking through some of the collaborative engagements that we're participating in. So Climate Action 100, we're engaging with some of the largest, the top emitters. Through CDP, we have sent out letters to a number of companies requesting that they set science-based target initiatives. And then we are engaging with, so we wrote out to 36 companies through IIGCC, which is the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, requesting that they report Paris-aligned accounts. LAP, which you'd be familiar with, the Local Authority Pension Fund Forum, does climate engagements on our behalf, and they embed the just transition topic within those climate engagements. And that's one of those issues that kind of straddles both climate change and human rights, and it's all about the social considerations in the decarbonisation journey. And finally, we engage with the banking sector through Share Action about their lending policies to fossil fuel companies. On natural capital, this is a new theme and an area that investors are focusing on now. We talked a lot about engaging with companies, but we also engage with policymakers. That's kind of our advocacy work. So through IPDD, which is the Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation, we engage with Brazilian policymakers to uphold the forest code in the Amazon, protect the Amazon rainforest, protect indigenous rights, and kind of reduce deforestation more broadly. Nature Action 100 is a new collaborative engagement, and it's very much our flagship natural capital engagement initiative. we're asking companies to align their business models with the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And then as you see, plastic pollution is also on here, so we're still retaining a focus on plastic, but largely through engaging with the petrochemical sector. I'll let Patrick run through the human rights and the sensitive.
Yes, so we've maintained human rights as one of our core engagement themes for a number of reasons. One of them is that there's lots of international law that places expectations on companies around how they manage human rights and human rights risks. It's clearly an area of interest to the pensions committees that we speak to, and through the membership queries and questions we get, it's clearly a hot topic, and will remain so. It is also an exposure in our portfolio because we do invest in emerging markets and we do invest in tech, and tech is becoming an increasingly large portion of the benchmark, and there are emerging human rights risks around how tech companies operate, and also their supply chains, touching other parts of the world such as China, Bangladesh, and India. So we've maintained that, and we have a number of contacts that we work with and collaborations afoot. The PRI have a human rights collaborative engagement called Advance that we're participants in. So it will remain a core theme for us. And then the last theme there is something that we've introduced really as a recognition of the fact that we need to maintain some bandwidth to respond to issues that occur in the portfolio. That during the course of the year there will be controversies, there will be topics that arise through our analysis that we do of the portfolio, but through the media as well, and through other organisations involved in responsible investment and sustainability. We need to make sure that we are able to engage with those companies and deal with that, and that we have bandwidth to do that. The other thing that we've also done is kind of recognise through our experience of the other four engagement topics that Sami just listed, was that often, we can engage bilaterally with the company and that can be successful, and sometimes it can't be. But what really moves the dial on plastic pollution, for example, or tax, is when governments introduce mandatory rules around disclosure, or, for example, we've been involved in an engagement around microfibers coming out of washing machines and encouraging the industry to put filters into these machines and stop these microfibers entering into the sewers and into the sea. And the French government introduced a rule mandating producers in that country to put these filters into the machines by law. As soon as the government acts, the whole of the industry moves forward on these things. So we are going to focus more time on advocacy because we think that's a better way of really impacting standards across the whole of the economy. So that some of these things like fair tax and plastics will be pursued through an advocacy government sort of engagement program with other investors and other investor organisations, of course. That's the logic behind that.
We go to the next slide, please. So we're just going to dive a bit deeper into each of these engagement themes. So with climate change, I'm sure you'll all be familiar. Climate change poses very much kind of macroeconomic and systemic risks, and we're very much wanting to see a orderly transition to a low carbon economy, as opposed to a disorderly transition to a low carbon economy, which would be a lot more costly, a lot more disruptive. It's pretty much well understood now that human influence is driving climate change, and it will disrupt companies' success if they don't manage those risks associated with climate change effectively. And the point here at the end around climate change being endemic, posing endemic risks, and being transgenerational in nature. If you go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the investment risk and opportunity, there's a point here around about 2% of assets are at risk of climate change impacts by 2100, and that could rise up to 10% in a worst case scenario. It's also really important to understand that pension scheme liabilities are long-term in nature. Climate change impacts are long-term in nature and can affect the liability side of the balance sheet. So it's really important that we continue to have a long-term focus on managing these risks associated with climate change. We want to see companies set credible net zero strategies which are underpinned by robust climate transition plans. We believe these companies will be a lot more resilient to operate in the future, and kind of steer away from the risk of stranded assets. There's also a point here around climate solutions being important to contribute to emissions reductions and meeting emission reduction targets and kind of limiting global warming. Can we just hop over to the next slide, please? So moving on to natural capital. Again, over half of global GDP, which is roughly around $44 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature. There's a positive feedback loop that exists between climate change impacts and its effect on biodiversity loss, and with climate change becoming one of the primary drivers of biodiversity loss in the coming decades. There's 5 key drivers of biodiversity loss that I wanted to touch on. So firstly, land use change, that'd be things like deforestation, climate change, which we've touched on previously, pollution, we've spoken a little bit about plastic pollution, natural resource use and exploitation. So think about things like overfishing and invasive species. I think we've all seen images or videos of like locust swarms kind of ravaging through ecosystems and causing a lot of destruction there. And again, very similar to climate change, the mismanagement of nature-related risks poses potentially serious systemic and macroeconomic risks. Can we go to the next slide, please? When it comes to the investment risk and opportunity, it's clear that degradation of nature can reduce a company's ability to generate long-term value for shareholders, primarily through a number of factors. For example, companies operating in areas where scarce resources exist. Think of a company operating in an area where water is scarce. That's definitely going to change how they operate. Regulatory tightening we're seeing around the world across jurisdictions. We're seeing lots of nature-related legislation coming through, and then also the reputational damage associated with mismanaging nature-related risks is also important to consider. We want companies to adopt more circular approaches, so reduce, reuse, recycle the materials that they use, and move away from a linear take, make, waste model. And it's also to recognise that it's important to recognise that there are new opportunities around nature-based climate solutions. I think about things like regenerative agriculture, investing in forestry, things like this. Can we go to the next slide, please? Patrick will talk through some of the human rights.
Yeah, so I won't dwell on the next couple of slides. Could we move on a couple of slides? Yeah, just to say on human rights, the important areas that we're looking at is governance. What governance does a company have around its human rights? How do they approach risk management? We expect them to take a risk-based approach. So companies that have operations in conflict zones clearly have more human rights risk exposure, and therefore we would expect them to have more robust policies and do more around the management of those risks and disclosure. I mentioned earlier that we value transparency in terms of ESG risk, and human rights is one of those. So another area that we're pushing on. We will use engagement, voting, and advocacy to try and move things forward in terms of corporate behaviour in terms of human rights. And we have a measures of success embedded in the engagement tracker that Sami just mentioned around outcomes, monitoring progress, our minimum expectations, and we will grade how a engagement is going on a scale of 0 to 3, with 3 being a successful outcome, 0 being no improvement or no discernible improvement. So that's how, and that methodology will apply to the other engagement themes as well. So could we move on to the next one, please? And again, this is just a reiteration really of what I talked about in terms of sensitive themes that, you could call it controversial themes, sensitive themes, how we're going to monitor and respond to those. They could be within the topics that we've discussed, the engagement themes that we've identified as being important, but they may not necessarily be so, but they will be significantly egregious for us to need to respond to them. So, and the same methodology of measuring the success of that engagement will apply. If you could move on to the next one, please.
I think this is the last slide pretty much. It just outlines some of the key organisations we partner with. We've touched on quite a few already. We mentioned Nature Action 100, Climate Action 100. This is the 30% club we're also a part of, which is all about encouraging board gender diversity. Patrick's mentioned about us being signatories to the Stewardship Code. So I'd encourage you, if you're more interested about learning a bit more about our approach to RI, our approach to stewardship, please go on our website and read that. And also we're signatories to the Principles for Responsible Investment. Our most recent report that we submitted, we scored 5 stars out of 5 out of the 6 areas we scored 5 stars on. So that's really, really positive there and demonstrates our commitment to responsible investing. So I think that closes out the presentation.
Yeah, I think just key takeaway from that last slide is that responsible investment teams across asset management businesses tend not to compete with each other. We tend to work quite collaboratively, and whilst we have to focus our attention because we can't address everything and we can't deal with every company in the portfolio, we will, it's generally accepted that some investors will lead on engagements with particular companies or particular issues and other investors will support. And we tend to spread ourselves in that way, in a collaborative way, to kind of increase the impact and influence and scope of things that get addressed across our portfolios in the real economy. So that's why it does lend itself to collaboration, it's more so than other aspects of financial services.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Patrick and Sameed. It's an area that you can tell that interests all members. And I think it probably enhanced our understanding of the action that you're taking, which is significant and quite reassuring. Now, has anybody got any questions? Melissa.
Thank you, Chair. It was just to clarify something you said, Sameed, that wasn't written down. So there was a statistic you gave that the strategy is based on the kind of investment strategy overall is based on assumptions that 1 to 10% impact. Sorry, about this was in under climate change. There was something about 1 to 10% of our investments will be impacted by 2100. Is that right? 2100 year by climate change. So only 1 to 10%. Is that did I?
So there's some estimates that say 2% of assets will be impacted by are at risk of the impacts of climate change by 2100. In a worst case scenario, that could go up to 10% of global assets being at risk from the effects of climate change. That's more along the lines of a worst case scenario. So if we're seeing warming going up 4 or 5 degrees as opposed to what we're aiming for, which is a 1.5 degree Paris-aligned low carbon economy.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the answer there, Sameed. And is that kind of an industry standard statistic, or where do we derive that from?
I'm not sure about this specific statistic. A lot of companies that we engage with, we engage the Paris Agreement, the goals of the Paris Agreement, we want to align with them. A lot of investors do that across all different types of collaborative engagements. That's pretty much the gold standard that we'd be like to press companies on.
I wouldn't necessarily recognise that number, and I think we need to go back and find out where that came from, because ultimately all of the companies in our portfolio have exposure to climate change. You can't diversify or stock pick to eliminate completely the risk of climate change from your portfolio. We know from from the reports we give to you that the companies that have the highest exposure to scope 1 and 2 emissions are often cement companies and utilities companies and steel companies who emit a lot of carbon and use a lot of fuel in their production process. So if there was a carbon price if the carbon price was to go up to $300, $400 a ton, those companies would be impacted. So, and then there's the physical risks. It depends on where the location of your assets are. If you're going to be exposed to increased flooding or more unpredictable weather, climate change could have impact on crime rates, migration, all sorts of different impacts. So it's very hard to model. Attempts at scenario analysis have suggested that the overall portfolio value could be around the 20% mark in a failed transition. But I think every company has an exposure, some more so than others, clearly, because we know that fossil fuels, for example, have an exposure to a transition to a lower carbon economy. Now, how that plays out and over what time frame is to be debated, but there's definitely more exposure for that industry than others. So we'll check that statistic out and try and understand where that number comes from.
Yep.
Thank you. I'd really appreciate that, because it struck me that that year, 2100, that's like my children's lifespan.
Yeah.
And it just struck me as financially odd that it was such a up to 10%. It just seems very odd. So I'd really welcome that, because that period of time and my understanding of the financially of the risk, let alone if we are in climate crisis, what value is in Shell and BP anymore and stuff. So it is just on a financial level, let alone that kind of ESG stuff.
And that is another weakness of scenario analysis, is that we have to project the impacts out quite a long way to really get the most egregious and severe impacts modelled. Then we try and bring that conversation back to now as to what we need to do about it now to avoid those impacts in 2040, 2050 and beyond.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. So, final question, Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Bill and Mr. Cartwright, and that, then we'll end it there. All right, Mr. Bill.
Yes. Thank you, Chairman. And I think this is a most encouraging report. And I think it's the best news we've had in what has been a really difficult week, quite honestly. I think we should try to disseminate this information to the people we represent, because there's so many people who are interested in all these topics. It's quite clear that the County Council and our friends here are taking this most seriously and tackling it. Could we find some way of encapsulating this news so that we can actually disseminate it out to the public? I mean, I know it's a huge subject, but if we could just let people know a sort of a summary on one side of A4 and give people the opportunity to then make their own inquiries.
I think it's very difficult, to be honest, to do it on one side of A4. You can see the extent, and I mean, there's nothing to stop you, David, but advising your each individual councillor can point to their within their division to your residents exactly what we're doing.
But I think it might be useful if the County Council itself, through its comms strategy, could actually put this message.
Certainly,
we are actually very positively
we could have a look and see if the comms team could do something to point people towards it. It is an area of great interest. Yeah. Our officers happy to do that. Yeah, see if we can do that, because there is huge good work going on. I tend to agree that it is reassuring. We can't solve, without being trite, we can't solve all the problems of the world. We can't answer all the questions, but there is clearly a strategy going forward, and progress is being made. I just, to be frank, I just wish the rest of the world, because this is just the LGPS central portfolio, but I mean, it's a problem for the whole world and all the countries, and we need sort of a unanimous approach on it, and I think eventually we'll get there. Now, I said I was going to take one more question. Who's that from? Right, I'm going to have Right, I really do want to move on after this because we've spent a substantial amount of time on this. Right.
Yeah, thank you. I was amazed at that figure of 1, 2 or 10%.
Yeah.
Given all the major cities in the world are on the edge of the ocean and the sea levels will cause massive problems with the assets located in those places. And also, I think it's well known that the next great threat to the world will be water wars when people have to move away from drought-ridden areas. And I just thought that figure should be well up into the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is different. Mr. Will, would you just turn your microphone off? All right. So we have had a comprehensive, and I think it's well worth spending time, and I welcome all the questions. And you will return again, Patrick, I'm sure you will.
Sorry, just to say that they've got 4 more slides in the private session on the.
Yeah, you have got 4 more slides, so we'll bring that. But for the time being, we are asked to note the report. Is everybody happy to do that? Yeah, that's unanimous. Okay, thank you both, Patrick and Sameed. Very much appreciated, and I think it's brought an element of clarity to what we are doing and how seriously we are taking it. So thank you. Stick, we can't have that. Right, all right, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I know there are a number of members who want to leave fairly soon, by 12 o'clock. So we will carry on. So now we come to the final substantive item on the public agenda, Adams Street Partners private equity presentation, which is at pages 225 to 250 of the agenda. Where's Bulesh gone? Oh, there he is. People keep disappearing. Bulesh, would you introduce the report? I'd like to welcome Mrs. Anna Maria Harrison, Mr. Ross Morrison, and Mr. Johan Hill, who are here today with us from Adams Street Partners, also to present the item. But first of all, over to you, Bulesh.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be relatively brief because I think you want to hear from our guests more than you want to hear from me. So it's just a brief intro into the fund's PE investments. As you know, our PE investments are managed by 3 managers, with the majority managed by Adams Street Partners, who are here with us today. 31st of December, the fund had total PE investments valued at about 422 million, about 6.9% of total fund assets. The target weight is 7.5%, so we're marginally below. We've got a long history investing with Adams Street, stretches back to about 2002. We've invested in most of their annual vintages and a number of their strategies, which Adams Street will talk about during their presentation. The majority is with Adams Street. As I said, it's about 385 million, or about 90% of our total funds PE investments. We also hold investments with 2 other managers. That's Aberdeen Standard Life, which is 1 vintage, and with LGPS Central, 3 vintages. Point 7 in that cover paper shows the most recent investment subcommittee approvals. I won't talk through those, just A, B and C, not huge numbers, but in keeping with keeping investments rolling through every year. Point 8, A through to E, talks about what the Adams Street presentation will cover. Any questions before we hand over?
Thanks. Has anybody got any initial questions? No? All right. So, Ms. Harrison, would you and your colleagues like to deliver your presentation? Thank you.
And keep it like that, yeah. Hi, good morning, and thank you for inviting us to the committee today. I am Anna Maria Harrison. I'm a partner in the investor relations team and work closely with our investment colleagues in managing the portfolio. I'm joined by Ross Morrison, a partner in our fund investing team, and Johan Hill, a director of ESG. If we look at page 5, we thought it'd be useful to provide an overview, a summary of the key messages. On the left-hand side, for those of you that are not familiar with Adams Street, we are a 100% employee-owned firm investing in private equity and private credit. That is all we have done. Oh. Okay. Great, thank you. On page 5, please. Great. Great, thank you very much. So left-hand side, it's some of our key facts on the firm. We have been doing private equity for over 50 years. That's all we do, and have 58 billion in assets under management. Have been an LGPS partner since 2002, and we're very grateful for your commitments and relationship with our firm. On the right-hand side are the key details on the portfolio. So we have been investing in private equity assets on your behalf since 2002, and the returns of the portfolio since then, so the internal, the IRR, net returns, so that's the average return of the portfolio since 2002 has been 10.8%, which is about 3.3% over the public market equivalent, which is the benchmark of the portfolio. If we look at the sterling figures, it's 13% since inception. We have been very pleased with the performance and also the fact that we have been able to outperform both the PME, the public market equivalent, and private equity benchmarks, but also have been able to have consistent returns throughout the various market cycles that we have gone through since we've managed money on your behalf. All of the 100% of the capital that you have provided to us has come back to you in distributions already. So these returns are returns that have been fixed. So we have given back capital, and there's still quite a bit of value in the portfolio. As you can see here, it's 370 million in sterling in net asset value still. And we'll talk about how the portfolio is positioned and when we expect those distributions to come through. If we go to the next slide, we thought it might be useful to highlight the also the rationale and the key success factors of investing in private equity. So the pros are quite strong. It's we hope to invest in an asset class that has attractive risk-adjusted returns, so providing value added from public markets, and that provides you with access to companies that are not available in the public markets. Those are the key aspects of private equity. Now, it is illiquid and valuations take a long time. As you will see later, we're going to be talking about Q3 2003 returns. So that is the latest valuations that we have in the portfolio. It is also very difficult to access investments, and my colleagues will talk about the importance of accessing the best performing funds and continuing to choose those managers in the future. If we move to the next slide, on page 7, we can see the various ways to invest in private equity and highlighting what we invest on your behalf as well. So investors can go directly into companies, and that's the green arrow at the bottom. They can go into funds, and that's the red arrow on the top, and also through fund of funds, which are fund managers, advisors that invest into other funds, and those funds invest into companies. So on your behalf, we have investments into both funds and fund of funds. If we move to the next slide, we can see the strategies that we invest on your behalf. We can see on the top left-hand side is primary investments. That's the team my colleague Ross invests in. We invest into funds, and usually those funds have 5 years to invest and 5 years to exit. There's also secondary investments where we buy positions into funds that we acquire from other investors. And those funds tend to be maybe 3 to 8 years old, so shorter duration in the portfolio. And then the two strategies on the bottom, growth equity and co-investments. Growth equity is tech and healthcare investments directly into companies, which is what we started doing when we started investing in the asset class in 1972. And co-investments is when we invest alongside our managers on your behalf. And all of this comes together on page 9. In your portfolio, about 80% of what we manage on your behalf, as was mentioned earlier, is into our single or vintage multi fund of funds program. This program includes all of our strategies, and it's a diversified program that provides access to all the key parameters of the asset class. About 20% of the portfolio is into more specific strategies that within our program or global funds program. If we now move to the next slide, when we look at performance, so there's a lot of figures on page 10, and I will just highlight some of the key details. So we have been investing money on your behalf since 2002 and have received commitments for 17 vintages of our global fund of funds program or comprehensive program. And then you can see at the bottom of the page, there's also commitments made to more specific strategies of secondaries, small market buyouts, and co-investments. The performance has been very strong. You can see the net returns and compare that to the public market equivalent on the right-hand side. You can see the summary on the bottom of the page, and the fact that most of the drawn amount has come back in distributions already. And on the next page, last page before I turn to my colleagues to talk about the investments, on page 11, you can see the intra-period returns of the portfolio. So one, we're very pleased with the since inception returns. Looking at long-term returns of private equity is very important, but we're also very pleased with the development of the performance. So as you can see, the gray bars, it's the performance of your portfolio compared to the blue bars, which is the public market equivalent. The outperformance has increased as investments mature and exits take place. So very pleased with the performance and the portfolio construction.
Great, thanks, Anna Maria. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having us here. I'd like to talk about what we do on the primary fund team, and that's somewhat represented by the outperforming investments on slide 12. As you see here, for confidentiality reasons, we can't disclose the names of the companies or the funds, but less to say, we in the primary team invest in a global way. So we meet every week and invest what we think are the best investments in the US, Europe, and Asia. And that allows our managers the ability to invest in what we think are some of the best performing companies in the private markets on a global basis. And those companies drive value on behalf of our clients, such as yourselves, and help drive value for our overall performance, which Anna Maria just took you through. At a high level, the benefits of investing in the private markets allow us to invest in some of the most innovative companies out there. So the term kind of new economy or digital economy helps drive things forward. It's really important. It's fast growing. It also creates a lot of employment. Some of the examples in your portfolio today in slide 12, there's a lot of incidents of great healthcare companies. So delivering healthcare services using technology and innovative ways to help with better healthcare delivery. Similarly, in the software space, providing innovative solutions to deliver efficiency in the enterprise or workforces, especially in the inflationary world that we find ourselves. Technology and these solutions can be a deflationary source, so help and drive great performance. I think what's interesting, if I move from slide 12 to slide 13, a lot of the most, I've talked about examples of great private companies that are innovative in the private markets. What we're increasingly seeing is a lot of those companies are coming from Europe today. They're becoming global champions. So Europe is increasingly having a greater dominance or participation on the global stage. Interestingly, when we talk about Europe, the UK is a significant driving force behind the contribution of these great innovative private companies. It started early, it has a head start. It's the largest hub for creating these companies within Europe, and we see a bright future for the UK in creating these companies. We'll talk more about them later on. Why we get excited about this, if you just kindly turn the page to slide 14, is the digital tech economy across all economies, but we'll speak about the UK here, is a significant contributor to employment growth. In fact, it's the fastest contributor to employment growth, and therefore when you hear government speaking about the importance of investing in into this part of the new economy, this is one of the main reasons why. And it's not just about creating digital jobs, because once you have a great successful digital company, there's actually a lot of non-tech jobs that are created around that, and that's what this bar graph on the right hand side speaks to. If we kindly just move to slide 15, so just recapping, sorry, 14 is moved on. 14% of the UK workforce today is invested and employed in the digital tech economy, and 37 of those percent of that 14% are in non-tech jobs. So there is a flywheel effect here. In terms of the source of some of these companies, if we move to slide 15, thank you. The UK has several tech hubs that measure up to, in some cases, the amount of companies being created in our university towns are creating tech companies that, or a number of tech companies that actually outcompete countries in Europe. And I think that just goes to show as a positive forward indicator of the level of innovation that we're hoping to finance and create employment going forward. And with that, I'll hand it to Johan.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ross. Good morning, everyone. As Director of ESG and Responsible Investing, my role is to support our investment professionals across the firm with ESG integration, reporting, and monitoring. On this slide, I'll just briefly touch on our approach to ESG, and then I'll turn to what it means in practice, and then some of the trends that we're seeing in the market. So Adam Street has a long-standing commitment to responsible investing. We've been early adopters of the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, and that's reflected in our ESG policy and our ESG program. On the slide, you'll see that we have 5 key priority areas within our ESG program. The first of which is ESG data transparency. And I think that's the main touch point with our clients. It's to do with how we report on ESG, how we monitor it, and provide that greater transparency, including on things like climate and other ESG factors. The other priority areas cover how we integrate ESG in terms of risk management, so reputation risk, and also the impacts that we try to mitigate, and also how we engage with our GPs and develop strategies that are more ESG focused or perhaps targeting positive impacts, so SDG aligned strategies. We don't do this in isolation from the wider industry. We work with industry groups. We use SASB for materiality analysis, ICI for climate action. We support them, and we also are members of the EDCI. Forgive the acronyms, a lot of acronyms, but this is an industry group that's more focused on improving the measurability of ESG within private equity portfolios, which is still a challenge in private markets. So if we move to the next slide, how does this work in practice? So in practice, our investment teams are primarily responsible for integrating ESG within the investment decision-making process. And that starts with the pre-investment screening. So we have various tools that we use to evaluate deals pre-investment before we make the deal in terms of diligencing. tools like RepRisk, which looks at ESG risks historically. We have an ESG checklist that creates a more standardized scorecard, if you like, so that we are ensuring that ESG factors are flagged when deals go to the investment committees for investment decision making. Post-investment, we're also actively monitoring the portfolios. The investment teams monitor all our underlying investments using RepRisk again, and we also do an annual ESG survey. So we survey 200 plus active managers each year, and the data that we gather feeds back through to our client reporting, but also back to our investment teams when they're evaluating new deals. And I'll on the next slide, I'll touch on some of the findings that we've gleaned from our recent surveys that hopefully give a sense of how ESG is evolving within private markets. So on this slide, I think the big picture is that over the last 2 years and even this year, we're doing our third comparable survey this year. What we've seen is encouraging signs of wider adoption of ESG within private markets and deeper adoption. And that's significant because private markets has historically been behind public markets for various reasons in terms of ESG adoption, but that's quickly changing. There's more widespread adoption now, and that's encouraging. The other encouraging sign that I would flag is we're seeing more metrics being captured at the underlying portfolio company level by the managers that we invest with. So as the old saying goes, what gets measured gets managed. We're seeing more measurement and therefore encouraging signs of more management of ESG within underlying investment portfolios. And thirdly, we're also seeing high levels of engagement with our survey process from the managers that we invest with. So when we started this process 3 years ago, we had a 64% response rate. It went up to 87% in the second year. Now we have, the survey results are just in, we have a 92% response rate. So all of this augurs well in terms of ESG practices within underlying investments from a risk management point of view and a value creation point of view. And so that's what we're seeing in the market. So I'll pause there in case there are questions, but I'll hand back over to Anna Maria.
Thanks very much, Johan. Has anybody got any questions that they want to ask? Roy.
Yeah, rather mundane one. It's remarkably good performance. Presumably we pay you fees for this. Then you employ funds of funds managers who charge fees, and then the funds charge fees. Why do you feel you have to go to funds of funds and not directly to funds? It's one extra tier of charges.
So we are the fund of funds manager. So there isn't an extra, we don't go into a fund of funds, we manage a fund of funds on your behalf, and then we go to other funds. So and very importantly, in 2017, we created an LGPS aggregation discount, whereby we treat your plan as if you were part of every pool. So any LGPS investor will come in and benefit from the aggregation discount, regardless of what pool they're in. So we've got a very, very, I think we provided fee analysis from pre-pooling and post-pooling, and it's about a 37% discount.
Melissa.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all three of you for the presentation so far. I'm trying to I think I'm interested in this ESG stuff, and I think when we often talk to fund folks about this stuff, because we can kind of see who we're invested in, and we can kind of maybe understand, for example, that with our investments in BP, there might be climate change issues and stuff. I guess that's harder here because we can't see them. And it's also, I think, for you, Johan, especially harder to give us the reassurances about that, because we can't necessarily see the tangible gains that are being created on the basis of that. And also, of course, because we started almost, they're hard and difficult to get into these places. So when you're in, you almost have to be grateful. I'm trying to understand the dynamics of those conversations a bit, and looking for some reassurance about kind of tangible outcomes and ensuring that we are meeting those ESG goals of our, you know, for the members in our fund. And then just a question to Ross about you talked a lot about digital tech in lay human terms. Do we mean AI, or what is that what we mean there? Thank you both.
Sure. Yeah, transparency is definitely a challenge in private markets because it's you know, historically that data hasn't been there, but that's beginning to change with some of the initiatives that we mentioned before. That said, what we've been able to do is use other ways of trying to glean information to provide you with that reassurance in terms of that these investments are actually not in very carbon intensive industries. I think we can do analysis in terms of the sector breakdown. What you're seeing is that the sector exposure to energy or utilities is much lower than you would have in public markets. So about 2.7% by NAV. And also that translates into a lower carbon intensity generally. So in excess of half of the carbon intensity of your typical public market benchmark portfolio. So I think generally the outlook is good, but we're not complacent there. We're trying to provide more transparency, particularly around climate, because that tends to be the big topic for many of our investors, and not exclusively, but it's certainly a big one. And what we're trying to do through the process of the annual surveys is get more insights into not just the underlying investments that they're making, but what the practices are and what the you know, target setting is like at the manager level. And again, that's something that we'll be monitoring year on year, and if necessary, engaging with those high risk managers or high risk segments of the portfolio to understand what their action plans are.
Martin. Oh.
I agree. Climate change is a hot topic in this stuff, not least because I think it carries. I think we have to be aware of the fiduciary responsibility that is carried with things that kind of add to the carbon footprint. But I guess I'm also. It isn't just that, you know, the ESG stuff that our policies are around, you know, and the more we talk to a fund, people from the funds, you know, we've heard about this morning about modern slavery, we've heard about child labour, we've heard about human rights abuses, we've heard about what were they called? Something weapons, the bad weapons, not the good. Yes. You know, we're hearing all of this stuff, and I guess it would be really helpful to have within the anonymity you must provide a breakdown, I guess, of those sorts of risks wider, if that's okay to request, Chair, please. Thank you.
And we have access to that information, and we can provide it. We have a system where we'll be able to let you also look at the information.
Yeah, I should just point out that as part of the monitoring that we do, those are the issues that we're monitoring for. So if there were any violations in terms of human rights or even exposure to controversial weapons, that would be flagged.
Yeah, good. That's good to hear, because we seem to focus on climate change, but there are a number of ESG issues. Yeah. So, you know, good point. Right, just Martin, and I
think I had a response to the councillor's
question
on technology, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
So there's, thanks for the question, there's really two different parts of technology that we invest in your portfolios invest in. There's mature and immature. So the mature are proven businesses, cash flows, profitable businesses growing. A good company would be, example would be a company not too far from here down in Nottingham called IdeaGen. It's a compliance and regulatory software company. So it makes sure that it provides software to a lot of companies that have tough regulations such as healthcare or life sciences, so they can make sure that they're doing everything that they should do to conduct their business. And software just makes that a lot easier. So that would be a mature example. And there's some good solutions there. We also specifically allocate a smaller amount to new technology, so venture capital, which could be disruptive. A company like a Revolut or a Monzo Bank, things like that, that are trying to create better ways of doing things. So those are the balance, roughly 70-30.
Okay, thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Chair. Well, the fund and the overall reason why we're all here is all beautifully tabled. If I can turn people to page 11, the internal rate return net graph. What it does set out, though, is, I'm not questioning it, it's just over the different reporting periods, the returns achieved are relatively stable, certainly over since its inception at 9.7%. No issue with that whatsoever. But over some of the reporting periods, the cost of administering the funds is greater or lesser than the returns achieved as a result of that. And that's not an issue either. There's all sorts of reasons why that would be shown in the way it is. I don't have an issue with that. But what I would ask, Chair, and it may well be that it can't be provided, but I'll make the request anyway. There is a happier picture in all of this, of course. We've achieved our goals. You've achieved what our aspirations are on behalf of us, and that's happy days. But there's a greater picture in here and a much happier picture, and that is the achievement overall. And the request there, Chair, we can report documents that are confidential, that are outside of the meeting, and it doesn't need to be in here. But I, going forward, would really love to see the same reporting graph, Chair, but just showing the gross and net rather than just the net of fees, because that tells just a slightly different picture, but a more happier one than what we're seeing before us, enabling us to not only celebrate the fact that we've achieved our goals, but that the fund administrators have achieved their goals too, showing a better picture. But I appreciate entirely that's something you might not want in the public domain. It doesn't set pounds, figures and pence, but it just shows that overall, because obviously it's achieved a lot greater than this in order for you to have recovered your fees. I don't want to be controversial. It's just be nice to see the happier picture overall in the trajectory of the whole scheme.
If I may add, it's included. It's the column that says gross IRR right next to it, not right next to net. So that is the gross figure. So the difference between the gross and net is the fees. What you would have seen as well is that the fees, the difference between gross and net it will be lower since 2017 when we started the LGPS discount. So yes, but we do provide it. We provide full transparency of all the fees, gross and net.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah. So Nick.
There are a lot of numbers on the page.
No, there are a lot of numbers in the page. Yes, there are. Nick.
Yeah, I noticed, as other members of the committee have said this, that the performance over the long term has been excellent. But that's been in a low interest environment. And with interest rates now going back up to what's regarded as more normal, what's the position going forward relating to private equity? Are you actually not going to be able to achieve these kind of levels because the interest rate is now much lower? Sorry, it was much lower then, it's now much higher.
Look, that's a great question. And you can see since we started, it was slightly higher interest rate environment, and now it's kind of come back to exactly the point that you make. Adams Street has a low leverage, high growth strategy. What I mean by that is within the private markets, you can choose to invest in different stages or sizes of companies. The larger the companies, the larger the transaction size, the larger they need leverage, which is, to your point, an increased cost of financing in today's environment. Our portfolio and your portfolio is disproportionately towards the smaller end of the market. So 80% of all the funds we back are on the smaller side of the buyout universe. And therefore the requirement for leverage is from 0 to on the low side compared to the rest of the market. And therefore the financing cost, because of a higher interest rate environment, will affect performance less. So we believe that our portfolio will continue to perform whereas those that are invested in the large end of the market, which is not your portfolio, will have a higher burden of financing costs, which could lower performance. But overall, we feel well, your portfolio is positioned well today and well going forward.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you, Ross. So that, if you can carry on, is that it? Yeah. Okay. All right. Yes, because we've got another couple of slides coming later in the private session. So thanks very much to Ross, Anna-Marie and Johan for a comprehensive report and answering our questions. So the committee is asked to note the report and presentation. Is that agreed? Yeah. Thanks very much. So the date of the next meeting is the 19th of June 2024 at 9:30. Item 14, we have no urgent items. We now come to item 15, which is the exclusion of the press and public. I move the public be excluded during the consideration of the remaining items in accordance with section 100A, subsection 4 of the Local Government Act 1972, exempt information. Is that agreed? Yeah. Okay. So we're now in private section once we've got the live stream finished.